Daemon Targaryen didn't want power. He wanted someone to finally tell him he deserved it. Spoilers ahead. What makes Daemon Targaryen one of the most psychologically complex characters in modern prestige television is not his brutality, not his dragon, not the marriages. It is the fact that every act of dominance in his life functions as a question he cannot bring himself to ask directly. He captures cities and walks away from them. He takes thrones and abandons them. He seduces, provokes, kills, and through every one of those actions, the same unresolved wound pulses underneath, invisible to everyone around him, possibly including himself. That wound is the real story. By the time Season 3 arrives, it will either consume him entirely or finally, for the first time, be answered.
To understand Daemon, you have to start not with what he does, but with what he is never given. He is the second son of a king who produced an heir before Daemon could establish himself as irreplaceable. He is brilliant by every measurable standard, militarily, politically, rhetorically, and he is told consistently throughout his entire life that brilliance without legitimacy means nothing inside a dynasty built on the myth of divine right. Viserys loves him. That is never in serious dispute.
But Viserys expresses love the way a man expresses love when he fundamentally cannot afford to take his brother seriously, with warmth, with affection, with the specific tolerance you extend to someone you've already decided will never hold real power.
That is the wound. Not hatred, not cruelty. Tolerance. Because hatred can be fought. Cruelty can be resisted. Tolerance, when it comes from the one person whose validation you need most, is the one thing that cannot be answered with a sword. Daemon's core psychological drive, the mechanism underneath every choice, is the pursuit of a moment where someone with genuine authority looks at him and says, "You were always the right one." His core fear, running in direct opposition to that drive, is that the moment will never come, that he is, in the deepest structural sense, unnecessary. Everything he does, the conquest of the Stepstones, the marriage to Rhaenyra, the positioning during the succession crisis, maps directly onto these two forces pulling against each other. He is not chaotic by nature. He is a man performing chaos because chaos is the only arena where the rules that excluded him stop applying. Walk through his key decisions as data points rather than dramatic moments, and a pattern emerges with uncomfortable clarity. The Stepstones campaign. Daemon fights a war nobody asked him to fight, wins it largely through his own design, and crowns himself king of the narrow sea, then immediately surrenders the crown to Viserys, in a gesture that the show frames as humility, but which functions, psychologically, as a test. He gives the prize back to see if Viserys will refuse it. If Viserys says, "Keep it, brother, you earned it," the need is partially satisfied. Viserys accepts the surrender without that acknowledgement. The test fails. Daemon files it. The marriage to Rhaenyra Velaryon. He chooses a woman of comparable dragon-riding status, builds something that functions like a genuine partnership, and by every surface metric appears content. Then Rhaenyra dies, and what follows is not grief in the traditional narrative sense. It is a man whose one functional relationship, built outside the structure that damaged him, is severed before he can prove it was enough. The return to Rhaenyra and Driftmark follows a logic that has nothing to do with romance alone. He returns because Rhaenyra is the only person in Westeros whose claim to legitimacy is more contested than his own, and loving her places him, for the first time, inside the succession rather than adjacent to it. He is finally, structurally, necessary. His War Council behavior in Season 2, the resistance to Rhaenyra's strategy, the solo operations, the unilateral decisions, reads as insubordination from arrogance on the surface. Measured against his psychology, it is something more specific, the behavior of a man who cannot function inside a hierarchy that doesn't acknowledge his primacy, even when that hierarchy is led by the woman he chose. The setting changes. The wound doesn't. Season 1 of House of the Dragon is not a succession story at its core. It is a story about what happens to exceptional people who are born into systems designed to make them feel insufficient. Rhaenyra and Daemon mirror each other structurally, both capable, both told their legitimacy is conditional, both forced to perform identity rather than inhabit it. The difference is that Rhaenyra eventually internalizes the institution's logic and attempts to work within it. Daemon never does. He externalizes it, weaponizes it, turns every room he enters into evidence for his own thesis. The system is arbitrary. I am better than it, and I will prove this by burning something. Season 2 deepens this by placing him in exactly the environment his psychology cannot survive, a war where he is subordinate, where strategy matters more than spectacle, where the validation he needs cannot be seized through a single decisive act. His arc in Season 2 is, structurally, a man whose coping mechanisms stop working. The chaos he manufactures to feel essential begins producing outcomes he cannot control. Aemond kills Viserys. The war escalates beyond the point anyone intended. The consequences of Daemon's psychology stop being personal and become civilizational. That escalation is the thematic core of the entire series. This is not a story about who sits on the Iron Throne. It is a story about what it costs a civilization when the people making its largest decisions are still in the deepest part of themselves, trying to resolve wounds from childhood. Here is where intellectual honesty requires a distinction. House of the Dragon, particularly in its second season, occasionally makes choices about Daemon that serve spectacle more cleanly than they serve psychological consistency. The Harrenhal arc is the most significant example. Daemon travels there, experiences visions, wrestles with guilt, and undergoes what the show frames as a spiritual confrontation with his past. The visual storytelling is striking. The performances are strong. Measured against his established psychological profile, however, the specific nature of that confrontation, the guilt, the softening, the apparent search for redemption, does not map cleanly onto a man whose entire operating system is built around the belief that the system failed him, not that he failed the system. A psychologically consistent Daemon would not seek absolution, he would seek confirmation. The show chose a more emotionally resonant arc, because emotional resonance is what sustains a prestige drama across multiple seasons. That is a legitimate creative decision. It is simply not the decision his psychology would have made for him. This matters because it creates a gap between who the show says Daemon is becoming and who the evidence of his behavior says he always was, that Season 3 will be forced to resolve. If Daemon were written strictly according to his established psychological architecture, the alternate path looks like this. He does not go to Harrenhal seeking spiritual resolution. He goes there because it is the geographically and symbolically correct position from which to demonstrate, to Rhaenyra and to the entire realm, that he alone can hold the center of Westeros. He musters the Riverlands not because Rhaenyra asks him to, but because controlling that muster is the kind of structural power that cannot be taken from him by council vote or royal decree. He builds leverage, not loyalty. When Rhaenyra's council makes decisions he disagrees with, he does not resist out of arrogance. He presents his own strategic alternative with the specific framing of a man who has been waiting his entire life for someone to finally listen. The tragedy of this version of Daemon is not that he is wrong, it is that he is frequently right, and still incapable of delivering that correctness without contaminating it with the need for acknowledgement. His best ideas lose allies because of how he holds them. The war then reaches a crisis point, and Daemon, consistent with his psychology, makes a unilateral move, not out of recklessness, out of the absolute conviction that the move will work, that Rhaenyra will recognize its brilliance after the fact, and that this will finally be the moment he has been manufacturing his entire life, where the most important person in the room turns and says, "I couldn't have done this without you." The consistent ending is not triumphant. It is the ending of a man who achieves everything he pursued and discovers the validation he needed was the one thing victory cannot produce. That is the alternate arc. It ends in the same place the canonical arc appears to be heading, but for a completely different reason and with a completely different psychological weight. Based strictly on narrative logic and established psychological patterns, here is where Daemon's arc must go in Season 3 if the show intends to honor what it has built. The war is escalating toward a point where individual brilliance stops mattering. Dragons are dying. The political coalitions are fracturing. The type of conflict that favored Daemon, personal, symbolic, high-stakes single actions, is being replaced by the kind of grinding institutional warfare that rewards patience and consensus, two qualities he has spent his life treating as concessions to mediocrity. This is the worst possible environment for his psychology. Season 3 should, following internal story logic, place Daemon in a position where his value to Rhaenyra's cause is genuinely in question, not because he is less capable, but because the war has evolved past the point where his specific capabilities are the decisive factor. The man who conquered the Stepstones alone is facing a war that cannot be won alone. The psychologically consistent response is not acceptance, it is escalation. When the arena stops rewarding his approach, a man with his profile does not adapt. He attempts to reshape the arena.
That likely means a unilateral action of significant consequence, a military decision, a political move, a direct confrontation with someone inside the Blacks' own coalition, something that forces the war to return to the terrain where Daemon is the most important person in the room. Whether that action saves the cause or fractures it is, structurally, irrelevant to him in the moment he makes it. What matters is the making.
Season 3 is, if the writing holds, the season where Daemon's psychology stops being a character texture and starts being the variable that determines the war's outcome. That is either the story of a man who finally gets his validation, or the story of what happens when a wound that size is given an army.
The popular reading of Daemon Targaryen is that he is the most dangerous man in Westeros because of what he is willing to do. The more accurate reading is that he is the most dangerous man in Westeros because of what he is still waiting to feel. Violence, in his case, is not a personality trait. It is a communication strategy. Every act of destruction is a sentence in an argument he has been making since the moment he understood that being exceptional was not the same as being chosen. The characters around him, Rhaenyra, Otto, Alicent, Aemond, are all in their own ways navigating the same institution. The difference is that most of them have at some level accepted the institution's terms. They may hate those terms. They may work to change them, but they have acknowledged the game. Daemon has never acknowledged the game.
That refusal is simultaneously what makes him the most compelling figure in the series, and what makes him, psychologically speaking, one of the most legible. A man who refuses to accept the rules of the game is a man who will always, eventually, force the game to end. The question Season 3 must answer is not whether Daemon survives, it is whether he ever gets what he was looking for. The more disturbingly logical question underneath that one is this: what happens to a man that driven when he finally does? The most dangerous version of Daemon Targaryen was never the one who had nothing to lose. It was always the one who finally had everything and still needed more.